Sometimes love doesn't feel like something you receive. It feels like something you have to earn. Not in obvious ways. No one tells you that directly. But somewhere inside you, there's a quiet feeling that if you stop trying so hard, something might disappear. So you try to be easy to love. You listen carefully. You help when people need something. You try not to cause problems. You become understanding. Patient. Supportive. Not because someone asked you to, but because a small voice inside you keeps whispering something uncomfortable. If I stop trying, will they still stay? So you adjust yourself. You try to be the person people won't get tired of. The one who understands. The one who helps. The one who doesn't ask for too much. And sometimes you don't even notice how much effort this takes. Until a moment arrives where you finally stop. You stop trying so hard. You stop proving your value. And suddenly something inside you feels exposed. Almost like love might disappear if you are not constantly earning it. If these reflections feel strangely familiar to you, you might find a lot of value in the conversations we explore here. You can subscribe if you want to keep exploring these patterns with us. Because the real question is not why you try so hard in relationships. The real question is, when did love start feeling like something you had to deserve? After a while, the effort becomes invisible. You don't wake up in the morning thinking, I need to earn love today. It's much quieter than that. It shows up in small adjustments you make without even noticing. Someone asks for help, and you immediately say yes. Even if you're tired. Even if you already have too much to do. Not because the request is unreasonable. But because saying no feels strangely uncomfortable. Almost like refusing might damage something important between you. So you say yes. And at first, it doesn't feel like a sacrifice. It just feels like being a good person, being supportive. Being someone people can count on. But then it starts appearing in other places. Someone seems a little distant during a conversation. And instead of simply noticing it, part of your mind starts working. Did I say something wrong? You replay the last few minutes. The words you used. The tone you had. Trying to find the moment where you might have made a mistake. Because if something feels different between you and someone else, part of you assumes that it must have something to do with you. And when that assumption becomes strong enough, something else follows. You try a little harder. You become more attentive. You ask if everything is okay. You offer support. You try to smooth the moment out. Not because someone asked you to fix anything. But because tension in relationships can feel almost like a warning signal. Like something important might break if you don't respond carefully. Over time, this effort becomes part of how you move through relationships. You try to be easy to love. You try to be helpful. You try not to create problems. And many of these behaviors are genuinely kind. There is nothing wrong with being attentive to people. There is nothing wrong with caring about how others feel. But sometimes the effort goes further than care. Sometimes it turns into a quiet form of pressure. Because somewhere inside you, there is a belief that love depends on how well you behave. How supportive you are. How patient you remain. How much you give. And when that belief becomes strong enough, something subtle begins to happen. You start monitoring yourself. The things you say. The reactions you show. The needs you express. Because expressing too much might feel risky. You might start wondering, will they still like me if I say this? Will they still stay if I stop being so understanding? And without realizing it, you begin adjusting parts of yourself to maintain connection. You become careful about how much space you take. Careful about how much you ask. Careful about how much frustration or disappointment you show. Because showing those things might feel like testing the limits of someone's patience. And if love feels like something that must be earned, testing those limits can feel dangerous. So instead, you try to stay on the safe side. You stay supportive. You stay understanding. You stay useful. And sometimes, the effort becomes so natural that you barely notice it anymore. Until a moment arrives when the balance suddenly feels uneven. You realize that you have been giving a lot. Listening a lot. Trying a lot. And yet part of you still wonders if it's enough. That quiet question appears again. Am I doing enough to deserve this? And when that question lives inside a relationship for long enough, something else begins to grow alongside it. A strange kind of emotional tension. Because when love feels conditional, even when no one explicitly says it is, you start moving carefully. You try to avoid mistakes. You try to avoid disappointment. You try to maintain the version of yourself that seems most acceptable. But relationships cannot remain stable forever when one person feels responsible for maintaining the connection. Eventually something inside you begins to feel tired. Not dramatically tired, but quietly exhausted. You might notice moments where you stop trying so hard. Moments where you don't immediately adjust yourself. Moments where you allow your real reactions to appear. And when those moments happen, something interesting appears with them. A small wave of anxiety. Almost like the relationship might become unstable if you stop performing the role you've been playing. Because if love has always felt like something you had to earn, letting go of that effort can feel almost like taking a risk. A risk that people might suddenly realize something about you. Something that you've been quietly trying to hide. That you are not always easy. Not always patient. Not always endlessly understanding. But the truth is that no relationship can survive on effort alone. Because effort may create stability for a while. It may keep things calm. It may prevent conflict. But real connection cannot exist if one person constantly feels like they must prove their worth. And this is where the deeper question begins to appear. Not the question about whether you are doing enough. But the question about why love ever started feeling like something that needed to be earned in the first place. Because patterns like this rarely appear out of nowhere. They usually begin somewhere much earlier. In moments where being loved felt connected to how well you behaved, how helpful you were, or how little trouble you caused. And to understand why the effort became so deeply connected to love, we need to look at where that belief first started forming. Patterns like this usually begin quietly. Long before we are old enough to question them. Because when you are a child, love is not something you analyze. It's something you feel. Or sometimes, something you try to protect. Children are incredibly sensitive to emotional signals. They notice the tone of a voice. The way someone sighs. The difference between a relaxed conversation and one that suddenly becomes tense. Even when no one explains what is happening, children feel the emotional atmosphere around them. And when that atmosphere becomes unpredictable, something inside them starts adapting. Not consciously, but instinctively. A child might begin noticing that certain behaviors create warmth. When they are helpful. When they are calm. When they don't cause problems. They receive smiles. Attention. Approval. But when they are difficult, when they ask for too much, when they express frustration or sadness, the emotional response around them might change. Not necessarily in harsh ways. Sometimes the changes are subtle. A tired parent who becomes distant. A caregiver who withdraws emotionally. A moment where affection becomes quieter. Children are incredibly sensitive to these shifts. And because their sense of safety depends so much on connection, they start trying to understand how to maintain that connection. They begin observing what seems to make love flow easily, and what seems to interrupt it. Sometimes they notice that being helpful makes people happier, so they become helpful. Sometimes they notice that staying quiet prevents tension, so they become quiet. Sometimes they notice that solving problems earns appreciation, so they become problem solvers. None of this happens because someone sits the child down and says, "You must earn love." It happens through small emotional patterns repeated over time. Moments where approval feels connected to behavior. Moments where affection appears more easily when the child is cooperative, understanding, or useful. And slowly, a belief begins forming in the background. A belief that often remains invisible for many years. The belief that love is connected to performance. Not performance in a dramatic sense, but in small emotional ways. Being good. Being helpful. Being easy. And because children depend on connection for emotional safety, they adapt quickly. They begin shaping themselves in ways that seem to preserve that connection. They learn which parts of themselves are welcome, and which parts feel risky. For example, a child may learn that being calm and supportive receives warmth. But showing frustration creates tension. So frustration gets pushed down. They may learn that being responsible earns praise. But needing help creates stress. So they become independent too early. They may learn that making others happy brings closeness. But expressing their own disappointment creates distance. So they become careful about showing it. And over time, the child develops a strategy that feels almost natural. If I behave in the right way, connection remains safe. If I become difficult, connection might disappear. And because the mind is constantly trying to protect connection, it keeps repeating the behaviors that once worked. This is how love slowly becomes associated with effort. Not necessarily because someone demanded it, but because effort seemed to maintain emotional stability. Effort seemed to prevent disconnection. Effort seemed to keep relationships safe. And once that association becomes strong enough, it doesn't simply disappear when childhood ends. It continues shaping how the person approaches relationships later in life. Because the mind carries the same quiet belief forward. Love is stable when I behave well. Love is safe when I try hard enough. Love remains when I am useful, patient, and understanding. So even when the environment changes, even when the people around you are not expecting you to perform in order to deserve affection, your mind may still be operating under those old emotional rules. You may still feel the subtle pressure to maintain connection through effort. To be the one who gives more. The one who adjusts. The one who ensures that relationships remain emotionally stable. And this can create a very specific emotional dynamic. You become someone who invests deeply in relationships. Someone who listens carefully. Someone who tries to support others. But alongside that generosity, another feeling may exist quietly beneath the surface. A sense that love could become fragile if you stop trying. A sense that being fully yourself might somehow be risky. That expressing certain needs or frustrations could change how people see you. Because somewhere inside, the child who once learned to maintain connection through effort is still active. Still trying to protect relationships. Still trying to ensure that affection does not disappear. And this is why people who carry this pattern often find themselves doing something very subtle in relationships. They try to anticipate expectations. Before someone even asks for something, they are already considering how to respond. Before someone expresses disappointment, they are already adjusting their behavior. Before tension appears, they are already trying to prevent it. From the outside, this can look like emotional intelligence. Like kindness. Like attentiveness. And in many ways, those qualities are real. But when they are driven by the quiet belief that love must be earned, they can also become exhausting. Because effort never truly feels finished. There is always something more you could do. Something more you could give. Something more you could improve. And that endless effort can slowly blur an important boundary. The boundary between caring for someone and proving your worth to them. When that boundary disappears, relationships can begin to feel like something you must maintain through constant emotional investment. Not because the other person demands it, but because your internal system believes that connection depends on it. And that belief becomes so deeply integrated that it can remain invisible for many years. Until one day, something begins to shift. You notice how much effort you are constantly putting into relationships. You notice how often you adjust yourself. You notice how difficult it feels to simply exist without trying to prove your value. And when you begin noticing that effort clearly, a deeper question starts appearing. Not just about your behavior, but about the emotional rule you have been living by. The rule that quietly says, love must be earned. Because once you begin questioning that rule, something else becomes visible. The ways that pattern continues repeating itself in your adult relationships. The moments where effort replaces authenticity. The moments where fear of losing connection shapes how you show up with others. And understanding those patterns is the next step in seeing how deeply this belief can influence the way love is experienced later in life. And this is where the pattern becomes easier to see. Not in childhood, but in the way it quietly shapes your adult relationships. Because by the time you grow up, the belief that love must be earned no longer feels like a belief. It simply feels like reality. You meet someone new. The connection feels good. The conversation flows easily. But even in those early moments, something inside you begins working. Not in an obvious way, but in small adjustments. You try to be attentive. You listen carefully. You respond thoughtfully. At first, that effort feels natural. After all, when we care about someone, we want to show up well. But when love feels like something that must be earned, the effort doesn't stop there. It continues. You start noticing the other person's reactions more carefully. The way they respond to your messages. The tone of their voice during conversations. The subtle shifts in their mood. And when those shifts appear, your mind becomes alert. If they sound distant, you wonder if you said something wrong. If they seem distracted, you wonder if you disappointed them. If they take longer to reply than usual, you wonder if you did something that changed the way they see you. And suddenly the connection doesn't just feel like something you are experiencing. It feels like something you must maintain. So you try a little harder. You become more understanding. More patient. More accommodating. You try to avoid behaviors that might create tension. You try to be the version of yourself that seems easiest to love. Sometimes this shows up in very subtle ways. You hesitate before expressing disagreement. You soften your opinions. You delay saying things that might create conflict. Because conflict can feel dangerous when love feels conditional. If love depends on how well you behave, disagreement might feel like a risk. So instead of saying exactly what you feel, you adjust the message. You choose softer words. You try to keep the atmosphere calm. And again, many of these behaviors come from genuine care. But when they are driven by the quiet fear of losing connection, something begins to change inside the relationship. You stop showing up fully as yourself. Not intentionally, but gradually. Certain reactions get filtered. Certain needs get postponed. Certain frustrations remain unspoken. Because expressing them might disturb the balance you have been working so hard to maintain. And when this pattern repeats often enough, another feeling begins appearing beneath the surface. Fatigue. Not the obvious kind, but a quiet emotional tiredness. You may notice moments where you feel strangely drained after interactions. Even when nothing dramatic happened. Even when the conversation seemed pleasant. Because while the interaction looked simple on the outside, something else was happening internally. You were monitoring. Adjusting. Trying to maintain emotional harmony. Trying to ensure that nothing disrupted the connection. That invisible effort consumes energy. Energy that most people never notice because they are simply being themselves. But when you are constantly trying to protect the relationship from tension, your mind never fully relaxes. It stays alert. It stays careful. And eventually, that constant attentiveness begins to feel heavy. Another place where this pattern becomes visible is in the way you respond to appreciation. When someone expresses gratitude or affection, you may accept it. But part of you might still feel uncertain. You might think, do they really mean it? Or, would they feel the same if I stopped trying so hard? Because when love has always felt connected to effort, unconditional appreciation can feel unfamiliar. Your mind may still be searching for the conditions. The reasons. The behaviors that explain why the affection exists. And when those reasons are not obvious, part of you may start working harder again. Trying to maintain whatever created that closeness. This is also why people who carry this pattern sometimes struggle with receiving care. When someone offers support, you may feel uncomfortable accepting it. You might feel the urge to give something back immediately. To restore balance. Because receiving love without earning it can feel unfamiliar. Almost like something is missing from the equation. If love has always been connected to effort, then receiving it freely may feel confusing. And so the effort continues. You try to give more. You try to help more. You try to prove that you deserve the connection you have. But over time, something important begins to shift. You start noticing the imbalance. You start noticing how much of the relationship depends on your effort. You start noticing how often you adjust yourself in order to maintain harmony. And once you begin seeing that pattern clearly, a deeper question appears. Not just about what you are doing, but about why the effort feels so necessary. Because when a pattern repeats across many relationships, it rarely comes from the present moment alone. It usually comes from a deeper emotional rule that has been guiding your behavior for years. A rule that may sound something like this: if I stop trying, love might disappear. That rule may have helped you maintain connection in the past. It may have helped you adapt to emotional environments where stability depended on how carefully you behaved. But in adult relationships, that same rule can quietly reshape the way you experience love. Instead of feeling safe enough to simply exist inside the relationship, you may feel responsible for sustaining it. Responsible for keeping it stable. Responsible for ensuring that affection continues. And that responsibility can make love feel less like something you experience, and more like something you must maintain. Something you must protect. Something you must prove you deserve. And when that belief becomes strong enough, it begins influencing nearly every interaction. Every disagreement. every moment of tension, every small emotional shift between you and someone else. Because when love feels conditional, the mind becomes extremely sensitive to signs that it might disappear. Which means that even ordinary emotional fluctuations in relationships can trigger a sense of urgency. You try to repair the moment. You try to restore closeness. You try to ensure that nothing has been damaged. But as this effort continues repeating itself, another realization slowly begins to appear. One that changes the way the pattern is understood. You begin noticing that the effort itself is not really about the other person. It is about the emotional rule you learned long ago. The rule that says love must be earned. And once you begin recognizing that rule, something important becomes possible. You can start looking at the pattern not just as behavior, but as a strategy your mind developed to protect connection. And understanding that strategy is the first step towards seeing how it operates inside your emotional system today. Because once you begin seeing the mechanism behind the effort, the pattern itself starts becoming easier to question. Not by forcing yourself to stop caring, but by understanding what your mind has been trying to protect all along. And that is where the next part of the exploration begins. Understanding what your emotional system is actually trying to do when it turns love into effort. At some point, something subtle begins to change. Not necessarily in the relationship, but in the way you observe yourself inside it. You begin noticing the effort, the adjustments, the way your attention immediately moves toward protecting the connection. Maybe it happens during a conversation. You hear yourself agreeing with something you're not entirely comfortable with. And for a brief moment, you pause. You notice the adjustment happening in real time. Or maybe it happens after an interaction. You replay the conversation and suddenly realize how carefully you were managing the atmosphere. How you softened certain words. How you avoided certain topics. How you quietly tried to prevent tension. And once you start noticing these moments, something important becomes visible. The effort was never random. It follows a pattern. A pattern that appears whenever connection feels uncertain. Whenever someone's mood changes. Whenever a conversation becomes slightly tense. Your mind immediately moves into a familiar role. The stabilizer. The one who restores balance. The one who smooths emotional friction. And in many ways, this role developed for a very understandable reason. Your emotional system learned that connection could become fragile. That relationships sometimes required careful navigation. So your mind developed a strategy. A strategy designed to protect closeness. It learned to observe people closely. To anticipate reactions. To adjust behavior before conflict appears. This strategy can create the impression that you are simply someone who cares deeply about others. And in part, that may be true. But when the strategy becomes constant, it stops being just empathy. It becomes responsibility. You begin carrying emotional weight that does not fully belong to you. The responsibility for keeping conversations smooth. The responsibility for preventing tension. The responsibility for ensuring that people remain comfortable. And when you carry that responsibility long enough, something interesting begins to happen. You stop noticing how much of the relationship depends on your effort. It simply becomes normal. But once awareness begins growing, the pattern becomes easier to see. You notice how quickly your mind scans emotional signals. Someone becomes quiet, and your attention immediately shifts. You analyze their expression, their tone, their body language. You start searching for clues about what might have changed. And even before you fully understand the situation, another thought appears. Did I cause this? That question appears almost automatically. Not because there is clear evidence, but because your mind has learned to associate emotional shifts with personal responsibility. And when that happens often enough, another mechanism begins operating quietly in the background. Hyperattentiveness. Your attention becomes highly tuned to emotional fluctuations. You notice small signals that others might overlook. The slight pause before someone answers. The change in someone's tone. The difference between a relaxed smile and a polite one. This sensitivity can sometimes make you very perceptive. You may understand people's emotions quickly. You may notice when someone is struggling. You may sense tension before anyone mentions it. But when that sensitivity is connected to the belief that you must protect the relationship, it can also become exhausting, because your nervous system remains constantly alert. Scanning the emotional environment. Trying to ensure that connection remains stable. And when something disrupts that stability, your mind immediately begins searching for solutions. How can I fix this? What should I say? What should I change? And sometimes the answer your mind chooses is adjustment. You soften your position. You apologize even if you're unsure why. You offer reassurance. You take responsibility for restoring harmony. But over time, another realization begins appearing. You start noticing how much of this effort happens internally. The other person may not even expect it. They may not be demanding emotional perfection. They may simply be experiencing ordinary fluctuations in mood. But because your emotional system has learned to treat those fluctuations as signals of danger, your response becomes immediate. You try to stabilize the moment. You try to ensure that connection remains intact. And this is where an important understanding begins to emerge. The effort was never really about controlling the other person. It was about protecting yourself from the possibility of disconnection. Because for many people who carry this pattern, disconnection once felt deeply threatening. Not necessarily in dramatic ways, but in quiet emotional ways. Moments where affection became distant. Moments where tension lasted longer than expected. Moments where approval felt uncertain. And in response to those experiences, your mind built a protective system. A system designed to prevent those moments from repeating. But like many protective systems, it continues operating even when the environment has changed. Even when the relationships around you no longer require that level of vigilance. Your mind may still be running the same emotional program. Scanning for signs that love might disappear. And once you begin recognizing that program clearly, another shift becomes possible. Instead of assuming that every emotional fluctuation requires your intervention, you begin observing the pattern itself. You begin noticing the urge to fix. The urge to adjust. The urge to restore harmony. And when you observe those urges closely, something surprising often appears. Many emotional shifts resolve themselves without your intervention. Someone who seemed distant becomes relaxed again. Someone who seemed distracted reconnects naturally. The tension that felt threatening dissolves on its own. And when you witness those moments, a new possibility slowly begins emerging. The possibility that connection does not depend entirely on your effort. That relationships may contain fluctuations that are not your responsibility to manage. That someone else's mood does not always require your correction. But accepting that possibility can feel unfamiliar at first. Because letting go of responsibility may feel like letting go of control. And when control once protected connection, releasing it can feel risky. But slowly, as awareness continues growing, another perspective becomes available. The realization that love does not become stronger through constant emotional management. It becomes stronger through authenticity. Through the ability to remain present even when the emotional atmosphere changes. Through the freedom to exist without constantly proving your value. And when that realization begins taking root, the pattern itself starts losing some of its power. Not because you suddenly stop caring, but because you begin understanding what your mind has been trying to protect. Connection. Belonging. Safety. And once you see that clearly, another question begins emerging naturally. If love does not need to be constantly earned, what would it feel like to experience it without the effort? Once you begin seeing the pattern, something important starts changing. Not immediately. And not all at once. But slowly. Because awareness doesn't instantly erase habits that have been part of your emotional system for many years. The effort may still appear. You may still notice yourself adjusting your words. Trying to smooth conversations. Trying to make sure everyone around you feels comfortable. But something inside you begins observing those moments differently. Instead of assuming that the effort is necessary, you begin asking a quieter question. Is this really my responsibility? That question alone can change a lot. Because when you pause long enough to ask it, you start seeing situations more clearly. You notice that someone's bad mood might not actually have anything to do with you. You notice that silence in a conversation does not automatically mean disconnection. You notice that people sometimes experience emotions that have nothing to do with your behavior. And slowly, the belief that love must be constantly maintained begins loosening. Not disappearing entirely, but becoming less rigid. Less automatic. You begin allowing small moments where you don't immediately step in to repair the atmosphere. Moments where you simply remain present. Even if the emotional tone between you and someone else feels uncertain. At first, those moments may feel uncomfortable. Almost like you are neglecting a responsibility. Your mind may still whisper the old warning, do something. Fix this. Say something that restores balance. But when you resist that impulse just long enough, something interesting often happens. Nothing breaks. The conversation continues. The relationship remains intact. The connection survives the moment without your intervention. And experiences like that begin creating new emotional evidence. Evidence that relationships can contain small fluctuations without collapsing. Evidence that closeness does not always depend on your constant effort. This realization can feel surprisingly freeing. Because when love stops feeling like something you must earn, another experience becomes possible. You begin showing up more honestly. You allow yourself to express things without filtering every reaction. You allow yourself to disagree sometimes. You allow yourself to have moments where you are not endlessly patient or endlessly understanding. And when you do this, something unexpected often appears. People who truly value you rarely disappear. The relationships that remain strong are usually the ones that can tolerate authenticity. Not just kindness. Not just effort. But the real presence of another human being. Someone who sometimes feels tired. Sometimes disagrees. Sometimes needs support instead of providing it. And in those relationships, something important begins to shift. Love stops feeling like a performance. It begins feeling like a shared experience. Something that moves naturally between two people. Sometimes calm. Sometimes imperfect. But not dependent on one person constantly proving their worth. Of course, this transition does not happen overnight. Patterns that developed over many years often return in moments of stress. You may still catch yourself trying to restore harmony too quickly. You may still feel the old discomfort when someone becomes distant or upset. But now, something is different. You can recognize the pattern when it appears. You can see the effort starting to build. And instead of automatically following it, you can pause. You can observe the impulse without immediately acting on it. And that pause creates space. Space where new experiences become possible. Experiences where connection continues even when you are not constantly earning it. Experiences where affection remains even when you are not perfectly accommodating. Experiences where love feels less like something fragile, and more like something that can exist alongside your full, imperfect humanity. Because the truth is that love was never meant to be a constant test. It was never meant to be something you prove through endless effort. Real connection grows in a different environment. An environment where both people are allowed to exist without constantly performing. Where care flows naturally. Where imperfections are not treated as threats. And where love can appear not because someone earned it, but because two people simply chose to remain present with each other. And sometimes, the most important step in discovering that kind of love, is realizing that you were never meant to carry the entire weight of connection alone.